My name is Elise, and I am 34 years old. On my 31st birthday, I caught my husband with my best friend. 3 years later, at my cousin's wedding, he smirked at me across the table and told me that leaving me was his best move. Then a 3-year-old girl ran up and hugged me, shouting that she loved her mommy. Right behind me, a man walked into the room. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The evening had been a setup from the moment I walked through the gilded doors of the Oakridge Country Club. I had only attended my cousin's wedding out of a lingering sense of familial obligation, but I quickly realized my attendance was simply a source of entertainment for my relatives. When I found my seating assignment, I discovered that my mother, Patricia, had intentionally placed me at table 4. Table 4 was not just any table. It was exactly where my ex-husband Carter and my former best friend Vanessa were seated. For 2 hours I sat quietly enduring their whispered jokes and condescending glances. The reception hall was a lavish display of wealth featuring towering crystal centerpieces and waiters carrying silver trays of champagne. I kept my eyes focused on the dance floor, trying to remain invisible. I was wearing a pale silver dress that I felt confident in, but under the crushing weight of my family's judgment, I felt entirely out of place. The climax of their cruelty arrived just as the main course was served. The heavy crystal goblet tipped over with a sickening thud, sending a dark red wave of Cabernet cascading directly onto my lap. The cold liquid soaked instantly into the fabric of my pale silver dress, a dress I had carefully selected for this exact occasion. I gasped and pushed my chair back, but the damage was already done. Standing right behind my chair, holding an empty wine glass with a completely unapologetic smirk, was my ex-husband Carter. He did not offer a napkin. He did not offer a word of apology. Instead, he casually tossed a leather-bound checkbook onto the center of my dinner plate, right over my roasted asparagus. "Since you are crashing the VIP section, the least you can do is cover the corkage fee, Elise." Carter said, his voice loud enough to carry to the adjacent tables. He walked around my chair and slid into the empty seat next to Vanessa, my former best friend. She leaned into his shoulder, running her manicured fingers down the lapel of his tailored suit. Carter looked back at me, his eyes filled with pure contempt. "Leaving you to drown in your own mediocrity was my best move. Look at you. 34 years old, completely alone, and still coding supply chain software in a dark basement." I stared at the leather folder sitting on my plate. Inside was an invoice for $800. The country club we were sitting in was notorious for charging exorbitant fees for guests who lacked elite memberships, but I was a blood relative of the bride. My cousin was getting married on the dance floor just 50 feet away. Yet here I was, being treated like an unwanted trespasser, expected to pay for the simple privilege of sitting at the family table. Before I could even formulate a response to Carter, my mother Patricia leaned across the silk tablecloth. She wore a tailored emerald gown that practically screamed old money. She did not ask if my dress was ruined. She did not reprimand the man who had just publicly humiliated her daughter. Instead, she snatched my water glass away and slammed it down near her own plate. "Pay the tab and leave quietly, Elise," my mother hissed, her jaw clenched tight. She cast a nervous glance toward the wealthy parents of the groom, sitting at the next table, terrified they might witness a scene and damage her precious social standing. "You are embarrassing your sister, and you are embarrassing your father and me. You never should have come here if you could not afford to play by the rules." The sting of her words burned far worse than the cold wine soaking into my skin. It was the exact same tone she had used 3 years ago. I was 31 years old when I came home early from a tech conference and found Carter in our marital bed with Vanessa. I had packed my bags that very night and driven straight to my parents' house, seeking comfort and shelter. I had expected them to wrap their arms around me and tell me everything would be okay. Instead of holding me, my mother had sighed in exasperation. My father, Richard, had paced the living room, lecturing me about how I had driven Carter away by being a stubborn workaholic. They blamed my ambition. They said my obsession with building my logistics algorithms had made me a cold, neglectful wife. They told me that men like Carter needed constant attention and that I had failed in my fundamental duties. And the ultimate betrayal came just 2 months later. When I begged my parents for a $50,000 loan to formally launch my software company, they called me a delusional failure. They flat out refused to give me a single dime. But the very next week, they wrote a $50,000 check to Vanessa to help her open a luxury boutique in the city center. They claimed it was a solid investment in a young woman who actually knew how to present herself to society. They funded the woman who destroyed my marriage and left me to piece my life back together, completely alone. Now, sitting at this lavish reception, I looked at my mother's harsh, judgmental face. I am not paying an $800 fee for drinking tap water at my own cousin's wedding, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. My older sister Brittany let out a sharp, mocking laugh from across the table. Brittany had always been the golden child, the one who did everything right by my parents' standards. She adjusted her diamond necklace and looked at me like I was something she had scraped off the bottom of her shoe. "Oh, please, Elise, just pay the bill. We all know you probably maxed out your meager credit cards just to buy that dress and pretend you fit in here." Brittany leaned back in her chair, soaking in the attention of the other guests at our table. "It is honestly pathetic. You show up here single and bitter, trying to ruin the aesthetic of the evening. Just hand your credit card to the waiter before you make things even worse for all of us." I sat perfectly still. The ambient noise of the wedding reception seemed to fade into a dull roar. The clinking of silverware, the soft jazz playing from the stage, the murmur of hundreds of wealthy guests, all of it faded away as I looked at the people who were supposed to be my family. Carter was smirking, wrapping his arm tighter around Vanessa. My mother was glaring at me with raw embarrassment. My father, Richard, refused to even look in my direction, focusing intently on his expensive scotch. My sister Brittany was holding out her hand, gesturing aggressively for me to surrender my wallet. They expected me to break. They expected me to lower my head, pull out my worn debit card, and pay for the privilege of being abused. They had spent my entire life conditioning me to accept their cruelty as a normal family dynamic. They wanted me to scurry out the back doors of the country club so they could spend the rest of the evening making jokes about my pathetic, lonely existence. They thought I was still the broken woman who had fled her house in tears 3 years ago. I did not reach for my purse. I did not shed a single tear. I simply looked at Carter and offered him a calm, chilling smile. Before anyone at the table could utter another insult, the heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom swung open with a resounding thud. The sudden noise made several guests turn their heads. Running straight down the center aisle past the towering floral arrangements and the stunned bride was a tiny 3-year-old girl. She wore a custom designer flower girl dress made of cascading white tulle, and her dark curls bounced as she sprinted across the polished hardwood floor. She completely ignored the wedding party. She bypassed the wealthy relatives and the judging stares. She ran directly toward our table, her little arms outstretched and a massive grin on her face. "Mommy!" she yelled, her voice ringing bright and clear over the jazz music. She threw her arms around my neck, burying her face in my shoulder. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her close and kissing the top of her head, breathing in the familiar sweet scent of strawberry shampoo. The entire table went absolutely dead silent. Carter's arrogant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by sheer confusion. Vanessa dropped her fork onto her china plate with a loud clatter. My mother's mouth opened in shock, and Brittany lowered her hand, staring at the little girl as if she were a ghost. Carter leaned forward, his eyes darting between me and the child. "Whose kid is this, Elise?" he demanded, his voice dropping the playful arrogance from earlier. "Did you steal someone's child just to get attention?" My mother. Patricia gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. "Have you lost your mind, Elise?" she hissed. "Who is this child, and why is she calling you mother? Get her out of here before you humiliate us any further." I did not bother answering them. I just held my daughter tighter, feeling the steady beat of her little heart against my chest. The utter bewilderment on their faces was the most satisfying thing I had seen in years. They had spent the entire evening trying to break me down, to remind me that I was a worthless spinster with no future. Now they were staring at a reality they could not comprehend. Then the heavy, rhythmic sound of authoritative footsteps echoed behind me. The temperature in the room seemed to shift as a towering shadow fell over the table. "I am her husband," Dominic stated, his voice smooth, cold, and echoing with absolute, undeniable authority. "And I own this country club." Carter's outstretched hand slowly dropped to his side. The aggressive flush on his face instantly vanished, replaced by a sickly pale white. He stared at the black titanium card sitting on the invoice, recognizing the exclusive banking crest that only a fraction of a percent of the population possessed. Vanessa let out a small, strangled gasp from her chair. My father Richard froze entirely, his hand hovering over his Scotch glass. My mother's jaw practically unhinged, her eyes darting frantically from Dominic's perfectly tailored suit to the heavy titanium card on the table. "My concierge just informed me your credit card declined for the bridal suite, Carter." Dominic continued, his tone clinical and precise, slicing through Carter's remaining pride like a surgical scalpel. "It seems your revolutionary startup does not provide enough liquid capital to cover a single night in my hotel. Pack your bags. My security team is escorting you off the property in 10 minutes. Carter opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. The arrogant, wealthy persona he had spent the entire evening projecting had just been obliterated in a matter of seconds. He looked helplessly at Vanessa, who was now staring at her phone in absolute panic, frantically checking their banking apps. "You cannot do this!" Brittany shrieked, finally finding her voice. She stood up from the table, her face red with outrage. "You cannot kick the groom out of his own wedding reception. We paid to be here." Dominic shifted his gaze to my sister, his eyes flat and unforgiving. "You did not pay for anything. Your father's credit cards declined an hour ago. You have been drinking my champagne on my charity, and my charity just ran out." I stood up slowly, shifting Lily securely onto my hip. She rested her head on my shoulder, entirely safe from the chaos unraveling before us. I looked at the people who had spent my entire life telling me I was worthless. I looked at the parents who had funded my ex-husband's infidelity. I looked at the sister who relished in my pain. I looked at the man who thought leaving me was his greatest victory. "Have a wonderful evening," I said calmly. I turned my back on them and walked away. Dominic's hand resting securely on the small of my back, guiding us through the parting crowd of stunned guests, leaving my toxic family to face their ruin entirely alone. The morning sun poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the resort dining room, casting a warm golden glow over the breakfast buffet. Dominic and I sat at a quiet corner table overlooking the manicured green expanse of the golf course. The air smelled of fresh sea salt and roasted coffee. Lily was happily eating a plate of fresh strawberries, her face sticky with fruit juice, completely oblivious to the absolute chaos we had left in our wake the night before. I sipped my espresso, feeling a profound sense of peace settling into my bones. For the first time in my entire life, the heavy, suffocating chain of my family expectations had been completely severed. Dominic reached across the table and rested his large, warm hand over mine. His presence was a grounding force. We were just discussing taking Lily down to the beach to look for seashells when the peaceful morning atmosphere shattered. I heard the sharp, aggressive clicking of my mother's heels on the polished marble floor before I even saw her. Patricia and Richard marched toward our table with the kind of entitled, furious purpose that only comes from decades of unquestioned privilege. They did not look like parents who had just watched their daughter get publicly humiliated and vindicated. They did not look apologetic or remorseful for the way they had treated me. Instead, their eyes were locked onto Dominic with a hungry, calculating intensity that made my stomach turn. Without asking for permission or offering a morning greeting, my father pulled out a chair and sat heavily at our table. My mother slid into the seat next to him, smoothing the skirt of her expensive designer morning dress. They did not even glance at their granddaughter sitting happily in her high chair. "We need to have a serious conversation, Elise," my father announced, his voice carrying that familiar commanding tone he always used to bully his subordinates in corporate boardrooms. He completely ignored me the second the words left his mouth and turned his full attention to my husband. Dominic, I must admit, your little display last night was quite impressive. We had no idea Elise had managed to secure a man of your obvious financial standing. It is certainly a massive step up from Carter. I felt my jaw tighten at the sheer disrespect, but Dominic simply leaned back in his chair, his expression entirely unreadable. He did not offer a polite smile. He did not extend his hand for a shake. He just waited, letting the heavy silence stretch until my father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The point is, my father continued clearing his throat and trying to regain his footing. We are all family now, and family takes care of its own. Wilson Commercial Real Estate has hit a temporary rough patch. The commercial property market has been unforgiving lately, and we are facing a slight liquidity issue. Since you are now officially part of this family, Dominic, I expect you to do the honorable thing and help us weather this storm. It is a matter of family pride. Dominic raised a dark eyebrow, taking a slow sip of his black coffee. A slight liquidity issue. That is a very interesting way to phrase imminent corporate bankruptcy, Richard. My parents froze. The color drained from my mother's perfectly powdered face. They clearly had no idea that Dominic would already know the intimate, disastrous details of their failing empire. They had assumed he was just a rich man they could easily manipulate with talk of family honor and legacy. My father recovered quickly, slamming his hand flat against the table, causing the silverware to rattle. It is a temporary setback. I just need a $3 million capital injection to clear our immediate outstanding debts and restructure our assets. $3 million is nothing to a man who owns this entire country club. Elise, it is time you finally did your duty as a daughter. Tell your husband to write the check right now. It is the least you can do after the stunt you pulled last night, embarrassing us in front of the groom's wealthy family and causing a scene. I looked at my father. He was completely serious. His eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate greed, but his tone was laced with the same arrogant entitlement he had wielded over me since childhood. He truly believed that I owed him this. He truly believed that my sole purpose was to act as a conduit to my husband's wealth so he could maintain his illusion of grandeur. I placed my coffee cup down on the saucer with a soft, deliberate clink. My duty as a daughter? I repeated the words slowly, letting them hang in the air between us. That is absolutely fascinating, Dad, because I distinctly remember sitting in your home office 3 years ago, asking you to do your duty as a father. I did not ask for a $3 million handout. I asked for a mere $50,000 loan to launch my software company. I brought you a comprehensive business plan. I showed you the market research. I begged you to believe in me just once in your life. My mother rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, exasperated sigh that drew the attention of a passing waiter. Elise, we are not talking about the past. Stop being so sensitive. We are talking about saving the family legacy today. I am talking about the past, Mom. I shot back, my voice dropping to a cold, hard whisper that cut straight through her dismissive attitude. Because when I asked for that $50,000, you called me a delusional failure. You told me my software was a complete waste of time and that I needed to focus on saving my broken marriage instead of playing business. You flat out refused to give me a single dime. But the very next week you wrote a $50,000 check to Carter to fund his revolutionary fitness app. You gave my cheating ex-husband the money I desperately needed to survive. My father scowled, his face turning an angry shade of red. Carter had a solid pitch. He was a charismatic businessman with a vision. How were we supposed to know the app would fail completely and that he would mismanage the funds? It was a calculated business risk. You gave him the money because you respected a man who cheated on your daughter more than you respected your own daughter. I stated plainly, leaning forward so they could not escape my gaze. You bet on Carter, and you lost spectacularly. His app crashed and burned within 6 months, leaving you with nothing. Meanwhile, the software I built in a dark basement without a single shred of your support is currently running the logistics for 3 of the largest shipping conglomerates in North America. I built an empire while you funded a fraud. The reality of my words seemed to bounce right off their hardened egos. They did not care about my pain. They did not feel remorse for their betrayal. They only cared about their immediate financial survival and the preservation of their country club status. Patricia leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into vicious, calculating slits. She was done playing the role of the desperate mother and revealed the ruthless manipulator underneath. "Listen to me very carefully, Elise." Patricia hissed, her voice dripping with toxic venom. "You are going to get your rich husband to write that $3 million check by the end of the day. If you refuse to help this family right now, I will personally make sure you live to regret it for the rest of your miserable life. Your grandfather's $10 million trust fund unlocks next month. You know exactly what I'm talking about. If you do not secure this money for your father, I will have our lawyers legally remove you from that trust. You will not see a single penny of your grandfather's money. I will erase you from this family entirely and leave you with nothing." She sat back, crossing her arms with a triumphant, arrogant smirk. She thought she had won. She thought she held the ultimate leverage over my head. My father looked equally satisfied, waiting for me to panic and beg for their forgiveness. They thought the threat of losing $10 million would force me to bend to their will, just as it always had when I was younger and dependent on them. I did not panic. I did not even blink. I calmly reached out and picked up my espresso. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the rich, bitter taste of the coffee. Dominic sat silently beside me, a faint, proud smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He knew exactly what was about to happen, and he was simply enjoying the view. I set the cup down and looked directly into my mother's cold eyes. "You cannot cut me out, Mom," I said, my voice echoing with absolute, unshakable certainty. My parents stared at me, their triumphant smiles faltering slightly at my total lack of fear. "Because Dominic isn't the one with the money." I continued, leaning forward so they could hear every single syllable clearly. "You came to this table assuming that Dominic is my financial savior. You looked at his tailored suit and his black titanium card, and you assumed I married him for his money. You assumed he is the one bankrolling my life because you have never been able to imagine a world where I actually succeeded on my own." I watched the realization begin to dawn in their eyes, a slow creeping horror replacing their arrogance. "I am," I stated. "My software company went public 8 months ago. I am sitting on a personal net worth that makes your failing real estate firm look like a children's lemonade stand. And my tech company just bought the private equity group that holds your firm's $3 million debt." The absolute silence that followed my announcement was thick enough to choke on. The air completely rushed out of the room. My father, Richard, stared at me as if the polished marble floor of the dining room had just opened up and swallowed him whole. The arrogant red flush that had dominated his face moments ago vanished, leaving his skin an unhealthy, chalky white. Beside him, my mother, Patricia, looked as though she had been physically struck by a speeding vehicle. Her meticulously powdered face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered panic. They had approached our breakfast table dressed in their pristine morning golf attire, fully ready to bully a subservient daughter into handing over her new husband's wealth. Instead, they found themselves sitting across from the very architect of their impending financial ruin. I watched the exact second their survival instincts kicked in. The transition was so abrupt it was almost comical to witness. Patricia immediately dropped her vicious glare. She uncrossed her arms and leaned across the table, attempting to place her manicured hand over mine. I smoothly pulled my hand back before she could make contact, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso. The morning sun poured through the massive windows of the resort dining room, illuminating the desperate beads of sweat forming on my father's forehead. "Elise, darling," Patricia said, her voice trembling as she forced it into a high-pitched, syrupy tone of mock affection. "You must know we were just pushing you. We always knew you had this incredible potential inside you. Everything we did, the tough love, the refusal to give you that loan, it was all just a test to make you independent. We wanted you to stand on your own 2 feet without relying on our money. We knew you were strong enough to build something amazing all by yourself." Richard nodded vigorously, practically tripping over his own words to agree with her. "Exactly. We saw how Carter was holding you back. We had to show you the harsh realities of the business world so you would rise to the occasion and reach your full potential. We are so incredibly proud of the empire you have built. You passed the test with flying colors, Elise. Now, as a successful family, we can consolidate our assets and dominate the commercial real estate market together. We just need you to void that debt so we can restructure our portfolio and move forward as partners. The sheer audacity of their sudden affection made my blood run cold. They were trying to rebrand years of emotional abuse and financial sabotage as a loving parenting strategy. They thought a few hollow compliments would erase the nights I spent crying over my keyboard, desperate to make my code work, while eating cheap ramen noodles in a freezing basement. I picked up my napkin, gently patted my lips, and placed it down on the table. There was no test, I said, my voice devoid of any warmth. You funded the man who destroyed my marriage because you valued his gender and his empty charisma over my actual intellect. You left me with absolutely nothing. And now that I have everything, you are begging for a bailout. I am not your partner, Richard. I am your primary creditor. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off instantly. Wilson Commercial Real Estate owes my private equity group $3 million. According to the exact terms of the original loan agreement, which you signed when you leveraged your commercial properties, the debt is due in full by the end of the current fiscal quarter. That gives you exactly 45 days to liquidate your assets and pay me what you owe. I will not be granting any extensions or negotiating any payment plans. Patricia let out a dramatic gasp, pressing her hand to her chest. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. We will lose the firm. We will lose the family estate. You are practically leaving us out on the street to starve. I am simply finalizing a business transaction, I replied, echoing the exact phrase my father had used against me 3 years prior when he handed Carter that $50,000 check. I suggest you start looking for a real estate agent. Enjoy the rest of your breakfast. I stood up from the table. Dominic stood beside me, offering a polite nod to my horrified parents before guiding me out of the dining room, leaving them to choke on their cold eggs. The impending collapse of the family empire sent shockwaves through the rest of the relatives. By mid-afternoon, the resort was buzzing with panicked whispers. Brittany, my older sister, was in a state of absolute hysteria. Her lavish lifestyle, her designer clothes, and her luxury vehicles were entirely funded by the firm's expense accounts. Without the company, she would actually have to get a job. The thought of losing her unlimited credit line sent her spiraling into a frantic search for a solution. Desperation makes for strange bedfellows. While I was walking along the private beach with Dominic and Lily, Brittany sought out the one person who hated me as much as she did. She found Carter sulking in the resort lobby waiting for his economy ride share. Dominic's security team had forcefully evicted him from the bridal suite and dumped his cheap luggage by the revolving glass doors. Carter was broke, publicly humiliated, and burning with a toxic desire for revenge. Vanessa was nowhere to be seen, having likely abandoned him the second she realized his credit cards were declining. Brittany knew that Carter had briefly consulted for my father's firm during the early years of our marriage. He had helped set up their internal accounting servers before he decided actual work was beneath him. Brittany cornered him near the luggage carousel and offered him a desperate deal. If Carter could find a way to eliminate the $3 million debt, Brittany would ensure he received a massive cut of her future trust fund payouts. Carter did not hesitate. He pulled his laptop from his duffel bag and used an old backdoor administrative login he had deliberately left active on the Wilson Commercial Real Estate servers. Sitting in the corner of the lobby, Carter and Brittany spent 2 hours meticulously fabricating a digital paper trail. They created fake ledger entries and forged wire transfer approvals designed to look exactly like I had illegally siphoned $50,000 from the family business accounts 3 years ago. They framed the timeline to perfectly match the week I launched my software startup. Brittany fed him the exact dates and account routing numbers needed to make the transactions look legitimate. Their plan was malicious and incredibly straightforward. They were going to threaten me with federal embezzlement charges. If they could prove my multi-million-dollar company was built on stolen funds, they could legally seize my assets and void the debt entirely. Later that afternoon, Dominic took Lily to the resort courtyard to look at the fountain. I was walking through the grand lobby toward the concierge desk to confirm our dinner reservations. The lobby was expansive, featuring towering marble pillars and a federally regulated banking branch situated directly in the center to accommodate the wealthy international guests. I was just passing the bank tellers when a hand suddenly grabbed my upper arm. I spun around to find Carter standing there, a feral, desperate grin plastered across his face. Brittany hovered a few feet behind him, clutching her designer purse with white knuckles, looking around nervously to see if anyone was watching them. Carter shoved a thick stack of freshly printed ledger documents directly into my chest. He was practically vibrating with malicious excitement, holding the papers like they were a winning lottery ticket. "You really thought you could outsmart me, Elise?" Carter sneered, his voice low and threatening. "You thought you could buy your way into power and just crush your family. Well, I just spent the last 2 hours auditing the firm's old servers. I found the exact $50,000 wire transfer you authorized right before you left me. You did not build your little logistics empire from scratch. You embezzled from your own father to fund your startup." I glanced down at the papers in his hand. The forged signatures and fabricated dates were glaringly obvious to anyone who actually knew how to code secure financial software. But Carter was too arrogant to realize his own incompetence. "This is federal fraud," Elise Carter whispered, leaning in close so I could smell the stale alcohol and nervous sweat radiating off him. "If I hand this ledger over to the authorities, the SEC will freeze your company assets by tomorrow morning. Your stock will plummet and you will be facing 10 years in federal prison. But I am a reasonable guy. Sign over the holding rights to the $3 million debt right now, and I will quietly destroy this evidence. Refuse, and I am going straight to the feds." He waved the printed ledger in my face, completely convinced he had just secured his financial future and orchestrated my ultimate downfall. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or try to grab the papers from his hands. I simply smiled and pointed to the security camera directly above his head. "I was hoping you would bring those forged documents onto federal property." Carter dropped the stack of forged ledgers as if the paper had suddenly caught fire. The arrogant sneer melted from his face entirely, replaced by the wide-eyed terror of a man who realized he had just walked blindly into a trap. He stared at the blinking red light of the security camera mounted directly above the concierge desk and then looked back at my calm, unblinking expression. He did not utter a single word of his planned blackmail speech. He simply turned on his heel and sprinted toward the revolving glass doors, leaving his cheap duffel bag sitting abandoned on the polished marble floor. I watched him run, knowing he was entirely out of place. But as I glanced toward the towering marble pillars flanking the lobby, I caught a glimpse of emerald green silk. My sister Brittany was hiding just out of sight, her manicured hands gripping her designer purse with white-knuckled rage. She had watched her pawn fail spectacularly, and knowing my sister, I knew she would immediately decide to flip the board completely. Brittany had always possessed a vicious kind of cunning when she felt her status was threatened. If she could not legally seize my assets to save our parents' failing real estate firm, she would settle for utterly destroying my reputation. She knew exactly where my vulnerabilities lay. My company, Apex Logistics Solutions, was exactly 14 days away from a highly anticipated initial public offering. We were poised to become a publicly traded entity, and the pre-market valuation was staggering. Brittany understood that investor confidence was incredibly fragile in the weeks leading up to an IPO. She did not need to prove anything in a court of law to hurt me. She just needed to plant a seed of doubt in the court of public opinion. Within hours of fleeing the resort, Brittany utilized the extensive network of sleazy socialites she had cultivated over the years. She reached out to Marcus Vance, a notorious technology journalist who had built his career on publishing sensationalized hit pieces and corporate gossip. Marcus did not care about journalistic integrity or fact-checking. He cared about viral engagement and generating ad revenue. Brittany invited him to a private lunch at an exclusive downtown club, charging the exorbitant bill to our father's rapidly depleting corporate expense account. Over expensive wine and imported caviar, she spun a masterfully fabricated web of lies. She played the role of the deeply concerned whistleblower sibling, torn between family loyalty and her moral conscience. She handed Marcus a silver flash drive containing dozens of falsified employee emails and manipulated code snippets. Brittany confidently claimed that my logistics software did not merely optimize supply chain routes for shipping conglomerates. She completely fabricated a narrative alleging that my algorithms actively harvested sensitive consumer data, intercepting personal shipping manifests, and illegally selling that private information to foreign data brokers. It was a wild, baseless accusation. But in the modern tech industry, the mere whisper of a data privacy scandal was enough to send investors running for the hills. Marcus published the hit piece at 6 o'clock the following morning, right before the financial markets opened. The headline was plastered across major tech blogs and financial news aggregators, screaming about a massive data breach and corporate espionage at Apex Logistics. I was standing in the center of my glass-walled office, overlooking the city when the fallout began. The giant monitors mounted on the wall of my trading floor flashed with angry red downward arrows. My chief financial officer was fielding back-to-back calls from nervous institutional investors demanding answers about the allegations. The pre-IPO valuation estimates began to take a significant temporary hit as the fabricated rumors caused a wave of market panic. I stood by the window holding a mug of black coffee, projecting an aura of absolute calm to keep my employees steady. I knew the code was clean. I knew the allegations were entirely fictional. But the market reacted to perception, not just reality. The heavy glass doors of my office swung open with enough force to rattle the hinges. Dominic strode into the room, entirely bypassing my frantic executive assistant. He did not look like the composed, calculating venture capitalist I had married. He looked like a man ready to wage outright war. He slammed his leather briefcase onto my mahogany desk, his eyes blazing with protective fury. He had already seen the article and he knew exactly who had orchestrated the smear campaign. "Give me the word, Elise." Dominic said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that echoed off the glass walls. "I have my entire team of corporate litigators waiting on standby. I will slap Marcus Vance and his publication with a defamation lawsuit so massive it will bankrupt them by Friday. And as for your sister, I will personally see to it that she is dragged into civil court for tortious interference. I will bury her in so much legal debt she will not be able to afford a cup of coffee, let alone a designer dress. Tell me to pull the trigger, and I will end this right now." I looked at my husband, feeling a deep swell of gratitude for his unwavering loyalty. He was ready to unleash his considerable power to protect me without a second thought. But I stepped away from the window and placed my hand gently over his, firmly shaking my head. "No, Dominic," I said, my voice quiet but resolute. "Call off your lawyers. I am not letting your legal team handle this. I am going to handle my family myself." Dominic frowned, the protective anger still radiating from his posture. "Elise, they are actively tanking your valuation 2 weeks before your IPO. Brittany is trying to burn your life's work to the ground out of pure spite. Why are you holding back?" I walked over to the desk and leaned against the edge, looking down at the red numbers flashing on my monitor. "Because this is exactly what Brittany wants," I explained. "She wants a messy public fight. She wants to play the victim while we look like the aggressive billionaires bullying her. And more importantly, this is a pattern. She has done this to me before, and I promised myself I would never let her get away with it again." I looked back at Dominic, feeling the familiar sting of an old, deeply buried memory. During my senior year of college, I was on track to graduate summa cum laude. I was at the very top of my class, carrying a perfect grade point average. Brittany had graduated 2 years prior with entirely mediocre grades, relying on our parents' wealth to secure her an entry-level job. She hated the fact that I was going to surpass her academic achievements. The night before my final capstone project was due, a project worth 50% of my final grade, Brittany decided to visit my campus for the weekend. I had spent 6 months coding that project. I stepped out of my dorm room for 20 minutes to grab a coffee from the library. I paused, taking a slow breath, as the frustration of that night washed over me. When I came back, my laptop was fully submerged in a bathtub full of soapy water. The hard drive was completely destroyed. Months of work gone in an instant. Brittany was sitting on the couch, filing her nails. She put on an incredibly convincing performance, crying and claiming it was a terrible accident. She said she had placed the laptop on the edge of the tub while drawing a bath to listen to music, and clumsily knocked it in. Dominic's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening with realization. It was not an accident. I continued, my voice devoid of emotion. She intentionally drowned my hard drive just to ensure I would fail the class and lose my graduation honors. And when I called my parents in tears, panicking about my destroyed project, they took her side. They bought me a cheap replacement laptop and told me to stop holding a grudge over a simple, clumsy mistake. They told me I was being vindictive and that family was more important than some silly college grade. I learned that day that my sister will happily burn down the entire house just to watch me choke on the smoke. She destroys what she cannot control. I could not prove it then, but I can prove it now. I turned my attention back to the massive monitor on my wall. I had not been standing idly by while the market panicked. I had spent the last 6 hours running a silent, aggressive digital trace. Brittany was a master manipulator in person, but she was technologically illiterate. She assumed that using a fake email address to contact Marcus Vance made her anonymous. She did not realize that the proprietary blockchain tracking software I designed, the very same software that optimized global shipping routes, could be utilized to trace digital footprints with terrifying accuracy. I had deployed a tracking algorithm the second the article went live. My software followed the embedded metadata within the fabricated code snippets she had provided to the journalist. It bypassed her clumsy attempts at hiding her IP address and traced the origin of the forged documents directly back to the secure wireless network inside my parents' mansion. I had irrefutable, federally admissible proof that the smear campaign originated from Brittany's personal devices. I did not need Dominic's civil lawyers to fight a slow, expensive court battle. I was going straight for the throat. My cell phone buzzed loudly against the glass surface of my desk. I picked it up and looked at the screen. It was a text message from Brittany. She had attached a live screenshot of a financial news channel showing the red downward trend of my pre-IPO valuation. She was clearly watching the market coverage from the comfort of our parents' living room, completely intoxicated by her own perceived victory. "Looks like your little company is going under." Read the message, followed by a heavily sarcastic smiling emoji. "Need a loan?" I did not feel a shred of anger. I felt absolute icy clarity. I did not type out a long emotional paragraph defending myself. I did not engage with her petty gloating. I simply opened the secure file directory on my phone, selected a specific highly classified document, and sent it as a direct reply. It was a single PDF document. It was not a lawsuit from my husband's firm. It was an official mandate bearing the federal seal of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. I had spent the morning on a direct line with federal regulators submitting the blockchain evidence of her digital sabotage. The document I sent her was a formal federal cease and desist order paired with a notice of an active criminal investigation against Brittany for deliberate market manipulation and corporate sabotage. The silence in the dining room became so absolute, so suffocatingly heavy, it felt as though all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the grand space. My father Richard sat frozen at the head of the table, his mouth slightly parted, his eyes darting frantically between my face and the small encrypted flash drive resting near his lawyer's hands. For a man who had spent his entire life projecting an aura of untouchable authority, he suddenly looked incredibly small. Patricia's hand remained plastered to her chest, her carefully manicured nails digging into her cashmere cardigan. Beside her, Brittany let out a sharp, ragged breath, the reality of her impending federal indictment crashing back down on her shoulders now that her parents' supposed rescue plan had been completely vaporized. "You're lying!" Richard finally choked out, his voice cracking entirely devoid of its usual booming resonance. "You cannot freeze my operational assets. You do not have the legal jurisdiction to unilaterally freeze a commercial entity of my size without a court order. I stood perfectly still, offering him a cold, pitying smile. I don't need a court order, Dad. I am your primary creditor, and you violated the core covenants of your own loan agreement. The lead attorney, Arthur Vance, reached out with trembling fingers and plugged the flash drive into his sleek silver laptop. The entire room waited in agonizing suspense as he clicked open the files. Arthur's eyes rapidly scanned the glowing screen, tracking across the digital documents. I watched the blood drain entirely from his face. He swallowed hard, nervously adjusting his silk tie before looking up at my father. "Richard," Arthur said, his voice stripped of all its previous arrogant swagger, "she isn't lying. The holding company governing your debt covenants includes a strict liquidity clause. Because your firm missed 3 consecutive quarterly margin calls, she executed a default override. Your accounts are locked." "Do something!" Patricia shrieked, slamming her hand onto the mahogany table. "You are our lawyers. Sue her, file an injunction." Arthur slowly closed his laptop and began neatly packing his briefcase. "Patricia, you cannot file an injunction with frozen assets. You literally cannot pay my retainer. Furthermore, any attempt to alter Theodore's trust documents while he is under Elise's legal guardianship would constitute federal fraud. We will not be participating in this matter any further." Without another word, Arthur and his partner stood up, gathered their files, and walked briskly out of the dining room, abandoning my family entirely. The sound of the heavy front doors clicking shut echoed through the mansion, sealing their fate. I announced, my gaze sweeping over the pathetic, broken remnants of my toxic family. "If any of you are still inside this house when my private security team arrives at 7:30, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing." I turned my back on them, walking out of the dining room, with my head held high, leaving them to drown in the ruin they had so meticulously built for themselves. I did not even make it halfway down the grand mahogany corridor before the screaming began. The heavy, stunned silence I had left behind in the dining room shattered into a million jagged pieces. Patricia's frantic footsteps echoed sharply against the marble floor as she sprinted after me. She was no longer trying to maintain her polished country club composure. She looked like a woman who had just watched her entire universe collapse into dust and was desperately trying to claw it back together with her bare hands. "You kidnapped him!" Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the mansion foyer. Her face was flushed an angry, blotchy red, and she pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my back. I stopped walking and turned around slowly. Richard was right behind her, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. "Where is my father, Elise?" Patricia demanded, taking another aggressive step forward. "You dragged a sick, vulnerable old man out of his home in the middle of the night. That is elder abuse. That is kidnapping. I am calling the police right now and having you arrested." She pulled her gold-encased smartphone from her pocket, her thumbs hovering frantically over the screen. She wanted me to panic. She wanted me to beg her to put the phone away, to negotiate, to surrender my leverage just to avoid a public scandal. She fundamentally misunderstood who she was dealing with. "Please do," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "Call the police, Patricia. Call the state troopers. Call the Federal Bureau of Investigation while you are at it. I would absolutely love to explain to law enforcement exactly why I had to hire a private tactical security team to safely remove my grandfather from this toxic environment." Richard pushed past my mother, his fists clenched at his sides. "You have completely lost your mind, Elise," he growled, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me. "Theodore is suffering from severe dementia. He does not know what year it is. He does not know his own name half the time. You forced a mentally incapacitated man to sign documents handing over his estate to you. That will never hold up in court. I am his son. I am his legally appointed caretaker. I have the medical records to prove he is incompetent. You have medical records from a crooked concierge doctor you paid to heavily overmedicate him." I shot back, my tone slicing through the air like a surgical scalpel. "You kept him locked in the east wing of this house, deliberately isolating him from the outside world. You fed him a steady diet of sedatives and tranquilizers so he would stay quiet and compliant while you systematically drained his life savings. But you made one fatal miscalculation, Richard. You assumed I would never visit him. You assumed I was as heartless and negligent as you are. Richard opened his mouth to deny it, but the words died in his throat. I reached into my tailored jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen twice, maximizing the volume. I did not need to argue with them. I had brought the ultimate trump card. I legally moved Grandpa Theodore into an exclusive private round-the-clock care facility 2 weeks ago. I stated holding the phone up so they could see the crisp, high-definition display. It took the medical staff exactly 4 days to completely flush your toxic cocktail of sedatives out of his system. Once his mind was clear, he was absolutely horrified to discover what you had been doing in his name. I pressed play on the screen. The video instantly lit up, displaying my grandfather Theodore sitting in a bright, sunlit room overlooking a serene private garden. He did not look like a frail, dementia-ridden old man. He looked sharp-focused and intensely angry. He was holding up that morning's edition of the Wall Street Journal to firmly establish the date and time. "My name is Theodore Wilson." My grandfather's voice rang out from the phone speakers, strong and undeniably lucid. "I am recording this statement freely and entirely of my own volition. For the past 3 years, my son Richard Wilson and his wife Patricia have kept me heavily sedated against my will. They falsely claimed I was losing my mind. They did this to isolate me so they could access my private retirement accounts and trust funds without my knowledge or consent." Patricia let out a strangled gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. Richard physically took a step backward, his eyes wide with absolute terror. The color drained from his face as he stared at the screen, watching his own father dismantle his life. Once my brilliant granddaughter Elise helped me relocate to a safe facility, I ordered an immediate forensic audit of all my personal finances. Theodore continued, his eyes narrowing with disgust. The results were sickening. Richard illegally siphoned $4.2 million from my secure retirement accounts. He did not use this money to save the family business. He used my life savings to fund the lavish, pathetic lifestyle of his eldest daughter, Brittany. He spent $700,000 keeping Brittany's failed fashion boutique afloat. He spent $400,000 buying her luxury sports cars. He stole my hard-earned money to coddle a spoiled, lazy child while completely ignoring the brilliant, capable granddaughter who actually deserved his support. I watched Brittany slowly creep into the hallway from the dining room. She stood frozen against the wall, listening to her grandfather publicly declare her a massive financial parasite. Her jaw hung open, but she could not formulate a single word of defense. "Therefore, effective immediately," Theodore announced, his tone ringing with finality, "I am revoking any and all power of attorney previously granted to Richard Wilson. I am officially appointing Elise as my sole medical and financial proxy. She has my full authorization to manage my estate, freeze my assets, and pursue aggressive legal action against Richard and Patricia for severe financial elder abuse. May God have mercy on you, Richard, because I certainly will not." The video ended, cutting back to a black screen. The silence in the grand foyer was suffocating. I locked my phone and slid it smoothly back into my pocket. At that exact moment, the heavy oak front doors of the mansion swung open. 2 men walked into the foyer carrying thick leather briefcases. It was Sterling, the family's personal wealth manager, and his senior associate. They had arrived exactly on time, summoned by Richard to rapidly restructure the firm's assets and draft the fraudulent paperwork needed to seize my grandfather's remaining trust funds. They stopped dead in their tracks the moment they saw the expression on Richard's face. Sterling had clearly heard the audio from the video playing through the open archways of the foyer. He was a ruthless wealth manager, but he was not stupid enough to risk federal prison time for a sinking ship. He looked at Richard, then looked directly at me. He processed the entire situation in a matter of seconds. "Richard," Sterling said, his voice tight with panic. "We were entirely unaware that Theodore was lucid. We were operating under your strict assurance that you held full medical and legal proxy. If you have been moving funds from his accounts without his explicit informed consent, we cannot represent you. Sterling, you cannot do this, Richard pleaded, taking a desperate step toward the wealth manager. I pay your firm millions in retainer fees. You have to help me fix this. We can draft a retroactive consent form. We can say Theodore was confused when he recorded that video. Sterling physically recoiled, holding his hands up as if Richard were suddenly contagious. You are asking me to actively participate in a federal cover-up of elder financial abuse, he stated loudly, ensuring there was absolutely no ambiguity in his refusal. My firm will not be party to fraud, Richard. Consider our professional relationship permanently terminated. Without waiting for a response, Sterling and his associate turned around, pushed the heavy oak doors open, and practically sprinted down the driveway toward their waiting luxury sedan. They left Richard standing in the center of his grand marble foyer, completely abandoned and entirely out of options. The empire was officially dead. I turned away from my parents, feeling nothing but cold indifference toward their incoming ruin. I walked toward the adjacent coat room to retrieve my tailored trench coat and my purse. I needed to return to my company headquarters to finalize the hostile takeover of their remaining commercial assets. I stepped into the dimly lit coat room, pulling my trench coat off the brass hanger. I set my leather purse down on the marble console table near the doorway, taking a moment to adjust my collar. As I reached for my purse, I heard the distinct, frantic whispering of two people rushing into the narrow service hallway positioned just behind the coat room wall. The acoustic design of the mansion made their voices echo perfectly through the thin partition. It was Carter and Vanessa. "We have to leave right now, Vanessa." Carter hissed, his voice shaking with panicked urgency. "You saw what Elise just did. She has Richard entirely backed into a corner with federal fraud charges. The SEC is going to seize everything in this house by tomorrow morning." "I cannot just leave," Vanessa whispered back, sounding completely terrified. "Brittany promised me a position at the firm. She said if I helped her deal with Elise, she would set me up with a massive salary." "Brittany has nothing," Carter snapped loudly. "The firm is dead." Elise froze their assets and seized the collateral. But Brittany still has her personal offshore accounts, the ones Richard set up for her in the Cayman Islands to hide the money he stole from the old man. I still have the administrative login credentials from when I worked on their servers. There was a brief pause, and I could clearly hear the sound of Carter frantically typing on his phone. "I need you to keep Brittany distracted in the living room for exactly 20 minutes. Carter instructed, his tone turning cold and ruthless. "I am going to log into her offshore accounts, transfer every single dime she has left into an untraceable cryptocurrency wallet, and then I am getting on the first flight out of the country. We can split the cash and disappear before the federal auditors arrive." "You want to steal Brittany's money?" Vanessa asked, her voice trembling. "Carter, if they catch us, we will go to prison." "They are not going to catch us because they are too busy fighting Elise," Carter fired back. "It is every man for himself, Vanessa. Are you in or are you going down with this pathetic family?" I stood in the coat room, perfectly still. A slow, dark smile spread across my face. I reached down to the marble console table and picked up my purse. I had not just set my bag down to adjust my collar. I had deliberately left my phone resting on the edge of the purse, with the high-sensitivity audio recording application actively running. I tapped the screen, saving the crisp, clear audio file of Carter outlining his entire conspiracy to commit international wire fraud. I slipped the phone securely into my pocket, fully prepared to hand the federal authorities the final nail in Carter's coffin. I slipped my phone securely into my pocket, the high-definition audio recording safely encrypted and backed up to my cloud server. I did not bother lingering in the dim coat room to listen to the rest of Carter and Vanessa's frantic, doomed scheming. I had captured everything I needed to guarantee their permanent destruction. I exited the mansion through the heavy side doors, stepping out into the crisp, unforgiving evening air. Dominic was waiting for me in the sweeping driveway, leaning against the sleek black frame of our town car. The mansion's exterior sconces cast dramatic directional lighting across the manicured gravel, highlighting the sharp protective line of my husband's jaw. He opened the passenger door for me, his eyes scanning my face for any sign of distress. He found none. I felt nothing but absolute icy clarity. "Carter is entirely out of his mind," I said, sliding into the leather seat as Dominic got in beside me. "He and Vanessa are plotting to drain Brittany's offshore accounts before the federal auditors arrive." Dominic shook his head, a dry, humorless chuckle escaping his chest. "They are turning on each other already, but Carter is a fool if he thinks he can access those Cayman accounts." The Securities and Exchange Commission froze all of Brittany's external assets an hour ago. The blockchain tracking software provided the feds with every single routing number. "I know," I replied, pulling my phone back out. "And that is exactly what makes Carter so dangerous right now. When he logs into that offshore portal and sees a zero balance, he is going to panic. He is facing absolute ruin, massive debt, and impending federal charges. A cornered animal will gnaw off its own leg to escape a trap. Carter is going to look for another way to secure cash tonight." Right as I spoke, a sharp flashing notification illuminated my screen. I pulled up the custom security application I had built to monitor my personal properties. I had designed the software entirely from scratch, utilizing a fluid responsive interface that provided real-time analytics. A bright red warning banner dominated the screen. "Someone just breached the primary access door to my old downtown apartment," I stated, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. Dominic immediately signaled our driver to change course toward the city. "Your old apartment? The one you use as a secondary office?" "Yes," I confirmed, my fingers flying across the screen to pull up the system logs. He knows I kept hard copies of my early financial ledgers there. More importantly, he knows that location houses my legacy hardware. My secondary office operates on a highly complex enterprise virtualization setup. It utilizes a dedicated vSphere environment to manage secure, isolated data silos. Carter used to help me maintain that hardware when we were married. He thinks he can use his old administrative credentials to bypass the primary vCenter server and access my original startup accounts. He is going to attempt a fraudulent wire transfer. Dominic concluded, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, calculating anger. "He thinks he can steal your seed capital and run." "Let him try," I said, leaning back against the leather headrest. The digital infrastructure in that apartment is completely different from what he remembers. The network now utilizes advanced machine learning algorithms, specifically deploying support vector machines to instantly classify and isolate unauthorized access attempts. If he touches that terminal, he is walking blindly into a digital bear trap. But I want to see the look on his face when it snaps shut. The drive into the city was a blur of neon streetlights and towering glass skyscrapers. The driver pulled into the subterranean parking garage of my old apartment building. Dominic and I bypassed the lobby, entirely taking the secure freight elevator directly to my floor. We stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway. The door to my apartment was slightly ajar. The heavy deadbolt had been violently forced, the metal casing splintered and bent. Dominic moved to step in front of me, his protective instincts taking over, but I placed a gentle hand on his arm, shaking my head. "I wanted to handle this." We pushed the door open silently and stepped into the entryway. The apartment was completely dark, save for the intense cinematic glow radiating from the massive array of high-resolution monitors in the center of the living room. The dramatic lighting cast harsh sculptural shadows across the walls. The space was a disaster zone. Heavy filing cabinets had been yanked open, their contents violently emptied onto the hardwood floor. Carter was kneeling amid a sea of scattered documents, sweating profusely, his hands trembling as he frantically tore through decades of old records. He looked entirely unhinged. His designer tie was pulled loose, his shirt soaked with nervous perspiration. He tossed aside tax returns and utility bills until he finally let out a sharp, victorious gasp. He scrambled to his feet, clutching a thick stack of faded papers. They were old joint bank statements from the first year of our marriage, back when our finances were briefly entangled, before I realized he was quietly draining my savings. He held the papers against his chest like a lifeline, his chest heaving with exertion. He practically threw himself into the ergonomic chair in front of my workstation. The mechanical clacking of the keyboard echoed sharply through the quiet apartment as he began typing with manic urgency. He was utilizing an outdated backdoor exploit, executing a sequence of commands he believed would override my banking firewalls. He was utterly convinced he was hacking directly into my primary corporate holding accounts. I stood in the shadows near the kitchen island watching him work. He navigated the interface, pulling up a wire transfer authorization screen. He hastily typed in a routing number linked to an untraceable offshore shell company. He punched in a staggering dollar amount, attempting to drain what he calculated was the entirety of my original seed capital. He slammed his finger down on the enter key, executing the transfer. The screen flashed a bright, solid green. Transfer initiated. Carter let out a wild, breathless laugh, burying his face in his hands. He thought he had won. He thought he had just secured his escape from the wreckage of my family. I reached out and flicked the main light switch, flooding the apartment with bright, unforgiving illumination. Carter violently flinched, spinning around in the chair so fast he nearly tipped it over. When he saw Dominic and me standing calmly in the center of his destruction, all the blood drained from his face. His eyes darted wildly toward the open door, calculating his odds of fighting his way past my husband. He quickly realized those odds were exactly 0. He scrambled backward, knocking over a stack of empty server boxes, but then his eyes fell on the green confirmation screen glowing behind him, and a sick, desperate courage seemed to wash over him. He snatched the old joint bank statements off the desk and brandished them like a weapon. "You are too late, Elise." Carter sneered, his voice cracking with panicked aggression. "I already initiated the wire. The money is gone. It is currently bouncing through 3 different international routing protocols, and you will never see a single dime of it again." I tilted my head, looking at the papers trembling in his fist. "What exactly do you think those old statements are going to do for you, Carter?" "These prove we commingled our assets during the marriage," he shouted, stepping out from behind the desk, trying to project dominance while visibly shaking. "I can use these to tie your entire startup valuation in court for years. I can freeze your assets just like you froze Richard's. You think you are the only one who knows how to play hardball. I have your original seed capital, and I have the leverage to destroy your IPO." He took another step forward, his eyes wild and completely disconnected from reality. "Here is how this is going to work," Carter dictated, pointing a finger at my chest. "You are going to log into your portal right now. You are going to drop the debt collection against your father's firm. You are going to release the hold on the operational assets, and you are going to call the federal regulators and retract every single piece of evidence you submitted against Brittany. If you do exactly what I say, I will reverse the wire transfer and give you your money back. If you refuse, I am walking out that door, and your logistics empire burns to the ground." He stood there, chest heaving, waiting for me to panic. He waited for me to beg, to negotiate, to surrender. Dominic did not say a word. He simply walked past Carter, completely ignoring the desperate man's existence, and stepped up to the built-in wet bar near the window. Dominic picked up a crystal decanter, unscrewed the heavy glass stopper, and casually poured himself a measure of aged bourbon. He took a slow, appreciative sip, a low, rumbling laugh vibrating in his chest as he leaned against the counter, highly entertained by the sheer magnitude of Carter's delusion. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us until I was standing directly in front of my ex-husband. I looked at the sweat dripping down his forehead. I looked at the faded, useless bank statements clutched in his trembling hands. "You really should have read the cybersecurity protocols I coded," I said, my voice eerily calm, slicing through his manufactured bravado. "You didn't wire my money to an offshore account, Carter. You wired it directly to the FBI's cybercrime division. They're tracking the IP address as we speak." The blood completely drained from Carter's face, leaving him with a sickly, translucent pallor that perfectly mirrored the glowing white text of the FBI warning banner now dominating the main monitor. He stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The reality of his situation crashed down on him with the force of a freight train. He had not hacked into my financial accounts. He had not secured his escape fund. He had just hand-delivered a mathematically verifiable confession of felony wire fraud directly to federal investigators. Panic, raw and absolute, finally broke through his paralysis. He dropped the useless stack of old joint bank statements. The papers scattered across the hardwood floor like dead leaves. He spun around, his wild eyes darting from my calm expression to Dominic, leaning casually against the wet bar. Carter did not attempt to negotiate. He did not attempt to beg. The pure adrenaline-fueled instinct of a cornered animal took over completely. He lunged forward, his expensive leather shoes scrambling for traction on the polished floor, and sprinted blindly toward the shattered front door of the apartment. He moved with the desperate speed of a man facing decades in a federal penitentiary. He cleared the living room, bolted past the kitchen island, and reached the entryway in a matter of seconds. He extended his hands, fully intending to shove the splintered door open and disappear into the labyrinth of the city streets. He never made it across the threshold. Two towering figures stepped out of the shadows of the exterior hallway, entirely blocking the exit. They were massive, their broad shoulders stretching the fabric of their impeccably tailored dark suits. Dominic's private security detail moved with silent, terrifying efficiency. Carter crashed hard into the chest of the lead guard, bouncing off the man as if he had run full speed into a brick wall. Carter let out a sharp cry of pain, stumbling backward. Before he could regain his balance, the second guard reached out, gripped Carter by the lapels of his sweat-soaked dress shirt, and forcefully shoved him back into the apartment. The guard kicked the splintered door shut with his heavy boot, sealing the room. Carter sprawled onto the hardwood floor, landing hard on his hands and knees amid the sea of documents he had ransacked. He scrambled backward like a crab, his breath hitching in his chest, until his back hit the cold metal casing of a server rack. He looked up at the two silent, unmoving guards standing shoulder to shoulder in the entryway, cutting off any hope of escape. Dominic took another slow, appreciative sip of his bourbon. The ice clinked softly against the crystal glass, the sound echoing loudly in the tense, heavy silence of the room. "Did you honestly think I would let you walk blindly into my wife's property unescorted?" Dominic asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You broke into a secured facility, destroyed private property, and attempted to steal millions of dollars. The fact that you thought you could just jog out the front door afterward speaks volumes about your profound lack of intelligence." Carter pulled his knees to his chest, hyperventilating. His eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for a weapon, an exit, a miracle. He found none. I stepped forward, closing the distance until I stood towering over him. I reached into my bag and pulled out a sleek black tablet. The screen automatically woke as I held it up, displaying a complex, continuously updating dashboard of digital analytics. "Let me explain exactly what you just did, Carter," I said, my voice crisp, analytical, and entirely devoid of pity. I tapped the screen, bringing up a real-time monitor that mirrored the activity on the main terminal. "When you used your old administrative credentials to log into this network, my security architecture immediately recognized the unauthorized access. It did not lock you out. Instead, it seamlessly diverted your session into a secure, isolated sandbox environment. A digital honeypot designed to look and feel exactly like my live financial database." Carter stared at the tablet, his chest heaving, the terror in his eyes magnifying with every word I spoke. "You spent the last 20 minutes interacting with a phantom server." I continued, my tone sharp and punishing. "But my system was not just watching you. It was permanently recording you. Every single keystroke you made, every folder you opened, every password you attempted to bypass was logged." I swiped a finger across the glass screen, pulling up a highly complex cryptographic sequence. "My proprietary software uses blockchain technology to track digital footprints," I explained, forcing him to look at the undeniable proof of his own destruction. "Blockchain is not just for cryptocurrency, Carter. It is a decentralized, immutable ledger. I integrated it into my security framework specifically to combat corporate espionage. The moment you hit the enter key to initiate that wire transfer, my software hashed your entire session data. It captured the exact MAC address of your burner laptop, the network routing protocols, and the unique digital signature of your activity. It encrypted all of that data into a permanent block on the ledger and transmitted it instantly to the federal authorities. Carter let out a strangled, pathetic whimper, burying his face in his trembling hands. You cannot delete a blockchain ledger, Carter. I stated, delivering the final crushing blow. You cannot manipulate it, you cannot erase it, and you cannot deny it. It is mathematically verifiable proof of your actions. The FBI currently possesses an unalterable time-stamped record proving your deliberate intent to commit felony wire fraud. You handed them a perfect closed case. The silence in the room became absolute, broken only by the low, steady hum of the server cooling fans and Carter's ragged, panicked breathing. He knew exactly what wire fraud carried. He was a man who had spent his career navigating the gray areas of corporate law, and he understood the federal sentencing guidelines perfectly. He was looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary, total financial ruin, and the complete destruction of his life. The sheer weight of that realization broke him entirely. The arrogant, calculating manipulator vanished completely, replaced by a terrified, desperate coward. He scrambled onto his knees, crawling across the scattered papers, until he was mere inches from my feet. He looked up at me, tears streaming freely down his pale, sweat-slicked face. "Elise, please!" Carter begged, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. "Please, you have to stop this. You have to call them off. I will do anything you want. I will sign whatever you put in front of me. I will leave the state. I will never speak to you or your family ever again. Just please do not let them send me to prison." I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. "I cannot call off a federal investigation, Carter," I replied coldly. "You crossed the line from civil dispute into federal cybercrime. The machine is already in motion." "It was not my idea," Carter screamed, his survival instinct overriding every ounce of loyalty he possessed. He grabbed the hem of my coat, his hands shaking violently. "It was Vanessa. It was Brittany. They made me do this." Dominic set his bourbon glass down on the wet bar with a sharp, decisive thud. He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing with sudden, intense interest. "Keep talking," Dominic ordered, his tone demanding absolute compliance. Carter did not hesitate. He threw the women under the bus with a desperate, breathless speed, eager to trade their freedom for his own. "Vanessa gave me the keys to this apartment," Carter confessed, the words spilling out of his mouth in a frantic rush. "She stole them from your purse months ago and had copies made. She gave me the old network passcodes she found in your home office. I did not want to do this, Elise. I swear to you I wanted to walk away, but Brittany promised me a cut." He swallowed hard, wiping a mixture of sweat and tears from his eyes. "Brittany told me that if I could breach your servers and secure your seed capital, she would wire me $1 million from her offshore accounts." Carter continued, detailing the entire conspiracy. "She said we could cripple your IPO and use the stolen funds to flee the country before the SEC finished auditing your father's firm. Vanessa was the one who scouted the location. She monitored your schedule so I would know exactly when the apartment was empty. They set this entire thing up. They used me as the fall guy. They manipulated me. You have to tell the FBI that I was coerced. I will testify against them. I will tell the feds everything they planned. Just let me walk out of here." He stayed on his knees, panting heavily, looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes. He had just confessed to a coordinated, multi-person conspiracy to commit federal theft, and he had implicated my sister and his own lover in the process. He truly believed his betrayal would buy his freedom. I stared at the broken, pathetic man kneeling on the floor of my office. He was willing to destroy anyone and everyone to save his own skin. I slowly raised my tablet, turning the screen so Carter could see it clearly. I had not just been monitoring his network activity. I had an active high-definition audio and video recording application running since the moment Dominic and I walked through the door. The screen displayed a live waveform capturing every single frantic, treacherous word Carter had just spoken. I hit a bright blue button on the touchscreen. A small loading bar appeared, rapidly filling from left to right, followed by a crisp green checkmark indicating a successful transmission. I looked down at Carter, offering him a sharp, merciless smile. "I just forwarded your confession to Vanessa." I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet apartment. I think she's going to be very interested in what you have to say about her at the charity gala tonight. I signaled my security team to step back from the splintered doorway. The two massive guards seamlessly parted, leaving a clear path to the hallway. Carter stared at the open space, his chest heaving, entirely unable to process the sudden shift in tactics. Get out! I commanded, my voice flat and completely devoid of pity. The federal authorities have your digital signature and your physical location tracked down to the millimeter. I want you in a room full of your peers when the reality of your situation finally sets in. Go to the gala, Carter. Go find your wife. He did not need to be told twice. He scrambled off the hardwood floor, his expensive suit wrinkled and covered in dust from the ransacked filing cabinets. He stumbled through the doorway, his breath catching in ragged, terrified gasps as he sprinted down the corridor toward the freight elevator. He was a man running on the pure, blinding adrenaline of impending doom. Dominic wrapped a warm, steady hand around my waist, his dark eyes gleaming with profound satisfaction. He pulled me close, placing a gentle kiss against my temple. You are a terrifying woman, Elise. Dominic murmured, a low rumble of amusement vibrating in his chest. You could have let the authorities arrest him right here in the dark. Instead, you are going to let him execute himself on the brightest stage in the city. A private arrest is far too merciful for a man who tried to steal my life's work. I replied, adjusting the collar of my trench coat. He wanted to play high-stakes corporate espionage. He is going to experience the public fallout of his absolute failure. We left the ruined apartment behind, descending to the subterranean parking garage where our town car was waiting. The drive toward the downtown financial district was swift, the neon lights of the city streaking across the tinted windows. The annual Metropolitan Children's Foundation Gala was the premier philanthropic event of the season. It was a mandatory appearance for the city's absolute elite, a glittering playground for venture capitalists, real estate tycoons, and old money socialites. It was exactly the kind of environment where my parents thrived, spinning illusions of wealth and power. Tonight, it would serve as the graveyard for their legacy. We arrived at the towering glass facade of the Crystal Pavilion just as the event was reaching its peak. The grand ballroom was a masterpiece of modern architecture, featuring vaulted glass ceilings, massive crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with cascading white orchids. A string quartet played a lively symphony in the corner, entirely drowned out by the overlapping chatter of 500 wealthy guests. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos navigated the crowd, bearing silver trays of vintage champagne and imported caviar. I paused near the entrance, my arm linked smoothly through Dominic's, scanning the massive room. It did not take long to locate my parents. Richard and Patricia were standing near a towering ice sculpture, completely surrounded by a group of prominent institutional investors. From a distance, they looked like the perfect picture of aristocratic success. But as I watched them closely, the cracks in their facade were glaringly obvious. Richard was sweating profusely, his face flushed an unnatural shade of crimson as he practically cornered a notorious private equity billionaire. He was laughing too loudly, gesturing frantically with his hands, desperately trying to pitch a bridge loan to save a commercial empire that I had already frozen solid. Patricia stood rigidly beside him, her knuckles white as she gripped her champagne flute. She was wearing a diamond necklace from 3 seasons ago, a desperate attempt to project liquidity while silently suffocating under the weight of her impending bankruptcy. They were putting on the performance of a lifetime, entirely unaware that their audience was about to witness a spectacular train wreck. The heavy double doors of the ballroom suddenly swung open with violent force. Carter stumbled into the venue looking like a man who had just crawled out of a war zone. His hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat, his tie was gone, and his eyes darted around the opulent room with manic, unhinged desperation. He shoved past a group of startled city councilmen, ignoring their indignant protests, his gaze sweeping the crowd until he finally spotted his target. Vanessa was standing near the main bar, wearing a shimmering gold evening gown, her face buried in her phone. Carter lunged across the ballroom, practically knocking over a waiter to reach her. He grabbed Vanessa tightly by the upper arm, his fingers digging into her skin. "We have to leave right now." Carter hissed, his voice strained and cracking. "We have to get out of this building and go straight to the airport." The plan failed. Elise knows everything. Vanessa did not flinch. She did not look scared. She slowly lowered her phone, her eyes locking onto Carter with a look of pure, concentrated venom. She yanked her arm out of his grasp with such violent force that he stumbled backward. "You think I am going anywhere with you?" Vanessa screamed, her voice tearing through the ambient noise of the ballroom like a siren. The string quartet faltered several notes, scraping harshly across their instruments before they stopped playing entirely. The sudden silence in the grand pavilion was deafening. 500 of the city's most powerful elite turned their heads simultaneously, their eyes locking onto the couple standing near the bar. Vanessa held her phone up the screen, glowing brightly in the dim light. "I just listened to the audio file Elise sent me." She shouted, her voice echoing perfectly off the glass ceilings. "I heard every single pathetic, treacherous word you said in that apartment." Carter's face drained of color. He reached out his hands, trembling violently. "Vanessa, keep your voice down," he begged, looking frantically at the crowd of billionaires and socialites forming a tight circle around them. "We can fix this. Just come with me." "Fix this!" Vanessa laughed, a harsh, hysterical sound that sent shivers through the crowd. "You told Elise that the entire offshore embezzlement plan was my idea. You told her Brittany promised you $1 million to steal her seed capital. You literally begged her to let you flee the country, and you offered to testify against me to save your own pathetic skin." Gasps rippled through the audience. Institutional investors who had been shaking Richard's hand moments ago now took large, synchronized steps backward, suddenly eager to distance themselves from the family. "You gave me the network passcodes." Carter yelled back, his survival instinct completely overriding his common sense. He pointed a shaking finger at his wife, publicly sealing his own fate. "You stole Elise's keys. You tracked her schedule. You set me up to take the fall for your toxic family's financial crimes. You and Brittany planned to use me to hack the servers, and now the FBI is tracking my digital signature because of your sheer incompetence." The mention of the Federal Bureau of Investigation sent a shockwave of panicked murmurs through the elite crowd. Richard stood frozen by the ice sculpture, his mouth hanging open, as he watched his son-in-law publicly confess to federal wire fraud and corporate espionage in front of every major banker in the city. Patricia covered her face with her hands, letting out a quiet, defeated sob as her social standing was instantly vaporized. Dominic and I stepped forward, stepping out of the shadows of the entryway and into the harsh, glittering light of the ballroom chandeliers. The crowd parted for us, automatically stepping aside as if we were royalty. I walked with perfect, unhurried posture, my chin held high, projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable authority. Brittany was standing near the main stage, wearing a custom emerald silk gown. She looked at Carter, then at Vanessa, and finally her eyes locked onto me. She saw the absolute ruin closing in around her. She saw the investors turning their backs. She saw her lavish, consequence-free lifestyle burning to ashes. And knowing Brittany, she immediately resorted to the only defense mechanism she had left. She decided to play the ultimate victim. Brittany pushed her way to the center of the room, throwing her arms wide open, tears instantly streaming down her perfectly contoured face. She pointed directly at me, her chest heaving with theatrical sobs. "Look at what you are doing to us," Brittany wailed, her voice carrying a tone of absolute manufactured heartbreak. "Are you happy now, Elise? Are you happy that you are destroying your own flesh and blood over petty jealousy?" The crowd shifted their gaze toward me, completely captivated by the unfolding drama. I stopped walking, standing perfectly still beside Dominic, allowing her to dig her grave even deeper. "You have always hated me," Brittany cried out, taking a step toward the audience, playing entirely to the crowd's sympathy. "You hijacked our grandfather's medical care. You kidnapped an elderly man suffering from dementia just so you could manipulate him into handing over his estate. You froze our parents' operational bank accounts out of pure spite. My father spent his entire life building a legacy for this city, and you are burning it to the ground because you cannot stand the fact that he loves me more than he loves you." "You are a cold, ruthless monster, Elise." She collapsed onto her knees, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with loud, dramatic sobs. Patricia rushed forward, kneeling beside her golden child, wrapping her arms around Brittany and glaring at me with raw, unfiltered hatred. They were putting on a masterclass in manipulation, desperately trying to turn the room of elite socialites against me, hoping to paint me as the aggressive corporate villain destroying a helpless, innocent family. The ballroom was completely silent, the tension so thick it felt like physical pressure. 500 pairs of eyes shifted from the weeping mother and daughter on the floor directly back to me, waiting for my defense. Waiting for me to argue, to scream, to engage in the messy emotional warfare my family thrived on. I did not argue back. I did not utter a single word of defense. I did not need to. I offered Brittany a slow, chilling smile. I unhooked my arm from Dominic's, stepped past my sobbing sister and my glaring mother, and walked with absolute precision toward the grand stage at the front of the pavilion. I ascended the carpeted stairs, my heels clicking sharply against the wood. I bypassed the ornate podium and walked directly to the professional audio mixing board, where the venue's DJ was standing wide-eyed and completely frozen in shock. I held out my hand, my expression perfectly calm. "Auxiliary cord, please," I requested. The DJ swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he unplugged a thick black cable from his laptop and handed it to me. I took the cord, pulled my encrypted smartphone from my trenchcoat pocket, and plugged it directly into the venue's master audio system. I pushed the brass auxiliary jack firmly into the base of my encrypted smartphone. The physical connection produced a sharp, resonant pop that echoed violently through the towering line array speakers suspended above the pristine dance floor. The sudden burst of electronic static caused the closest guests to physically recoil. The venue's hired DJ practically flattened himself against the velvet-lined back wall of the stage, raising both of his hands in a rapid, trembling gesture of total surrender. He wanted absolutely no part of the corporate execution I was about to deliver. He simply stepped away from the mixing board, leaving me in total control of the Crystal Pavilion's master audio system. I tapped the screen of my device. The custom interface of my security application pulsed once with a bright green light, and then the crystal-clear audio file began to play. The acoustic design of the coat room back at the mansion had been flawless, but magnified through a multi-million-dollar commercial sound system. The recording was devastatingly intimate. Carter's voice boomed across the grand ballroom with terrifying clarity. His panicked, desperate whispering washed over the 500 elite guests like a tidal wave of toxic waste. "We have to leave right now, Vanessa." His recorded voice echoed, shaking with an undeniable cowardly urgency. "You saw what Elise just did. She has Richard entirely backed into a corner with federal fraud charges. The SEC is going to seize everything in this house by tomorrow morning." A collective theatrical gasp rippled through the affluent audience. Women draped in haute couture covered their mouths with manicured hands. Men in tailored, bespoke tuxedos exchanged sharp, violently calculated glances. The notorious private equity billionaire whom Richard had been aggressively begging for a bridge loan physically took a large step away from the towering ice sculpture. He looked at my father with an expression of pure revulsion, treating the man like an infectious, highly contagious disease. "I cannot just leave." Vanessa's recorded voice whimpered through the heavy speakers, sounding entirely pathetic and terrified. "Brittany promised me a position at the firm. She said if I helped her deal with Elise, she would set me up with a massive salary." Down on the polished floor of the ballroom, Brittany's theatrical sobbing instantly stopped. She scrambled to her feet, the heavy emerald silk of her designer gown tangling clumsily around her ankles. She stared at Vanessa, who was still frozen perfectly still by the main mahogany bar. The horrific realization that her most loyal follower was entirely transactional, motivated strictly by greed rather than friendship, struck Brittany with the force of a physical blow. Her jaw dropped open, her perfectly contoured face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. "Brittany has nothing," Carter snapped over the speakers, his recorded voice dripping with absolute contempt for the woman who had just been aggressively defending his honor to the crowd. "The firm is dead. Elise froze their assets and seized the collateral, but Brittany still has her personal offshore accounts, the ones Richard set up for her in the Cayman Islands to hide the money he stole from the old man. I watched Richard as the recording laid his darkest financial crimes completely bare for the entire city to hear. The remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving him with a sickly, translucent pallor. He reached out blindly, his hand grasping the slick, freezing edge of the swan ice sculpture just to keep his knees from buckling under his own weight. The cold water dripped rapidly down his wrist, soaking the cuff of his expensive tuxedo shirt, but he did not seem to register the sensation. His eyes were wide and unblinking, fixed entirely on the marble floor, as his decades of careful social climbing, relentless manipulation, and brazen corporate theft unraveled in a matter of seconds. The audio continued entirely merciless. The recording captured the distinct, frantic clicking of Carter typing furiously on his mobile phone. Then his cold, ruthless instructions echoed off the vaulted glass ceilings, bouncing from pillar to pillar. "I need you to keep Brittany distracted in the living room for exactly 20 minutes, Carter dictated, outlining the mechanics of his betrayal. "I am going to log into her offshore accounts, transfer every single dime she has left into an untraceable cryptocurrency wallet, and then I am getting on the first flight out of the country. We can split the cash and disappear before the federal auditors arrive." "You want to steal Brittany's money?" Vanessa asked on the tape, her voice trembling with the realization of the massive felony they were plotting. "Carter, if they catch us, we will go to prison." The final absolute nail in the coffin was delivered with Carter's next breath. "They are not going to catch us because they are too busy fighting Elise." Carter's voice fired back with absolute sociopathic certainty. "It is every man for himself, Vanessa. Are you in, or are you going down with this pathetic family?" The audio file ended. The dead, heavy silence that immediately followed was suffocating. It was thicker and infinitely more destructive than the noise of the recording had been. No one moved a single muscle. No one spoke a single word. The entire ballroom was entirely paralyzed, trapped in the immediate shockwave of the most brutal, uncompromising public exposure this city had ever witnessed. Then the true consequence of the audio drop began to physically manifest across the room. It started as a low, rumbling murmur, a rapid, frantic whispering that swept through the ranks of the institutional investors, venture capitalists, and hedge fund managers. Hands reached swiftly into tuxedo pockets and evening bags. Hundreds of smartphones illuminated the dim, romantic spaces of the ballroom. I watched the private equity billionaire pull his phone directly to his ear, his commanding voice slicing clearly through the quiet, tense atmosphere of the room. "Cancel the term sheet immediately!" The billionaire barked to his legal team on the other end of the line, his tone completely ruthless. "Sever all ties with Richard Wilson's firm. Pull the funding. Liquidate the collateral. I want our capital entirely divorced from that family before the markets open on Monday." He was not the only one. Dozens of high-ranking executives were making identical panicked calls. Wealth managers, hedge fund directors, and commercial real estate developers were actively, aggressively burning their bridges with my father's collapsing empire in real time. The elite socialites who had fawned over Patricia an hour ago, desperate for an invitation to her summer galas, were now actively turning their backs. They physically shifted their bodies, forming tight, impenetrable circles that entirely excluded her from their ranks. Vanessa realized the gravity of her situation. She was completely surrounded by 500 people who now viewed her as a scheming, treacherous liability. She looked across the room at Carter, who was still standing near the bar, entirely broken by the public airing of his betrayal. Vanessa did not offer him a single word of comfort. She did not walk toward him. She hiked up the heavy skirt of her shimmering gold gown, pushed aggressively past a group of startled city councilmen, and ran directly toward the grand exit. She fled the ballroom, abandoning the room, her husband, and the family she had tried so desperately to exploit. Brittany finally snapped out of her paralyzed horror. She let out a piercing, genuine shriek of rage. She lunged across the dance floor toward Carter, her manicured nails curled like weapons, entirely ready to physically tear him apart for attempting to steal her offshore safety net. Two alert, massive security guards intercepted her before she could cross the room. They grabbed her by the arms, holding her back. As she screamed incoherently, her perfect, untouchable image shattered into a million jagged, irrecoverable pieces. I unplugged my smartphone from the venue's mixing board and wrapped the auxiliary cord neatly around my hand. I placed the device back into my trench coat pocket and walked back to the center of the stage. I stepped directly behind the main microphone stand, looking down at the absolute carnage I had orchestrated. Dominic stood near the base of the stairs, a silent, immovable fortress. He looked up at me, a sharp, deeply proud smirk playing across his lips. Patricia was shaking uncontrollably. Her entire body vibrated with a potent, entirely irrational rage. She ignored the wealthy investors actively walking away from her husband. She ignored her weeping, screaming daughter being restrained by event security. She marched directly toward the base of the stage, her fists clenched at her sides, looking up at me with eyes full of absolute delusional venom. She still believed she was the victim. She still believed she possessed some kind of moral high ground. "How could you do this to your family?" Patricia screamed, her voice tearing harshly from her throat, raw, desperate, and echoing through the massive pavilion. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her hysterical energy. I simply leaned forward, bringing my lips mere inches from the microphone. My response echoed cleanly, powerfully, and with absolute finality across the shattered remnants of the ballroom. "You stopped being my family the day you chose the man who betrayed me over your own daughter. I'm just letting you see who you really chose." The amplified echo of my voice faded into the cavernous upper reaches of the crystal pavilion, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt like a vacuum. The 500 members of the city's financial and social elite stood completely paralyzed, their champagne flutes hovering forgotten in the air. The glittering illusion of the Wilson family empire had been systematically stripped away, exposing the rotting, treacherous core underneath. I watched the exact moment the final fragments of the family alliance shattered into dust. Richard turned his head slowly, his neck moving with the stiff, mechanical hesitation of a man who had just sustained a fatal blow. His bloodshot eyes locked onto his golden child. Brittany was still kneeling on the polished marble floor, her emerald silk gown pooled around her in a chaotic, wrinkled mess. The audio recording had left absolutely no room for interpretation. Richard finally understood the staggering magnitude of his daughter's betrayal. He had broken federal laws, embezzled millions, and risked his entire legacy to fund Brittany's lavish lifestyle and failing vanity projects. In return, she had conspired with my ex-husband to drain the very last drops of capital from the firm, fully intending to disappear to the Cayman Islands, while Richard took the sole fall for bankruptcy fraud and elder abuse. "You were going to let me go to federal prison." Richard choked out his voice, a hoarse, broken rasp that carried easily through the hushed ballroom. "You were going to take the offshore money and run, leaving me to face the Securities and Exchange Commission entirely alone. I gave you everything, Brittany. I stole for you." Brittany scrambled backward, her hands sliding frantically across the smooth marble. "Daddy, no, you do not understand," she pleaded, her voice pitching into a high, grating whine. "Carter was lying on that tape. He is trying to frame me." But Richard was no longer listening. He staggered backward, clutching his chest as he collided heavily with the base of the swan ice sculpture. The freezing water splashed across his shoulders, but the physical shock did not register. The man who had spent his entire life valuing appearance and obedience over authentic love was finally drowning in the toxic reality he had created. Patricia, however, reacted entirely differently. My mother had spent her entire existence avoiding accountability. She possessed an unparalleled pathological ability to redirect blame, and right now she was facing total social annihilation. The elite women who used to hang on her every word were staring at her with open, unvarnished disgust. The hedge fund managers were actively texting their legal departments to completely sever ties with her husband. Patricia's entire universe was burning to the ground, but her deeply ingrained narcissism physically prevented her from looking at me and apologizing. To apologize to the daughter she had deemed a failure would require a level of humility she simply did not possess. Instead, Patricia found a much easier target. She spun around, her manicured hands curling into rigid claws as she locked her furious, unhinged gaze onto Vanessa and Carter. "You parasitic, ungrateful trash!" Patricia shrieked, unleashing decades of suppressed aristocratic venom directly into Vanessa's face. She completely ignored the watching crowd, her rage blinding her to any sense of social decorum. "We pulled you out of absolute obscurity, Vanessa. We allowed you into our home. We let you stand beside us at these galas when you had absolutely nothing to offer but your pathetic, desperate social climbing. And you repay us by conspiring with this useless, failed husband to rob my daughter blind." Vanessa recoiled, her face turning a blotchy, furious red. She had spent years biting her tongue, playing the obedient, sycophantic follower just to secure a crumb of Patricia's social standing. But the social standing was gone now, and Vanessa had nothing left to lose. "Do not! You dare act like you are the victim here, Patricia!" Vanessa screamed back, stepping directly into my mother's personal space. "You are a delusional, toxic old woman holding on to a sinking ship. You and Richard are going to be indicted by the end of the week, and you deserve every single second of it. You raised a spoiled, incompetent daughter who could not even run a basic fashion boutique without driving it into bankruptcy. Brittany came to me begging for help to hide the money because she knew you two were too stupid to outsmart federal auditors." Patricia let out a guttural sound of pure rage and lunged forward, her hands grasping wildly at the collar of Vanessa's designer gown. The two women violently collided, their expensive jewelry tangling as they engaged in a vicious, highly public physical altercation right in the middle of the dance floor. Carter saw the utter chaos erupting between his wife and his former mother-in-law and immediately decided to make his final, desperate bid for freedom. He ducked his head, shoved a waiter out of his path, and sprinted blindly toward the side exit leading to the kitchen corridors. He did not care about the money anymore. He did not care about his reputation. He only cared about evading the federal authorities who were undoubtedly tracking his location. He did not even make it 5 yards. Dominic's private security detail, who had seamlessly integrated themselves into the perimeter of the ballroom, moved with terrifying synchronized precision. 2 massive guards stepped directly into Carter's path, crossing their arms over their broad chests. Carter slammed on the brakes, his dress shoes skidding loudly against the polished floor. He looked wildly over his shoulder, only to find 2 more security operatives closing in from the rear. He was entirely boxed in, trapped like a rat in a maze, waiting for the inevitable arrival of law enforcement. Brittany watched her accomplices tear each other to shreds, her frantic mind calculating her absolute lack of options. The investors were leaving. The money was frozen. Her offshore accounts were empty. She was completely cornered, and the quintessential golden child realized that tears were no longer going to save her. She needed to drastically change the narrative. She needed a scapegoat massive enough to completely distract the room from her own glaring criminality. Brittany pushed herself up from the floor, her chest heaving as she smoothed down the ruined silk of her gown. She wiped the running mascara from her cheeks, her expression hardening into a mask of pure venomous desperation. She turned her back on her weeping, fighting mother and focused entirely on the lingering crowd of financial executives. "You are all listening to a fabricated audio file," Brittany shouted, her voice ringing out with a startling manufactured authority. She reached into her beaded clutch and pulled out her smartphone, holding it high above her head like a glowing beacon of truth. "Elise is a brilliant software engineer. She faked that recording using artificial intelligence to frame me, because she wants complete control of the firm's remaining assets." A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few of the older, less technologically savvy board members actually paused, their brows furrowing in confusion. Brittany saw their hesitation and immediately seized the opening, doubling down on her massive, desperate lie. "I have proof," Brittany cried out, practically shoving her phone into the face of a nearby banking executive. "Look at these emails. Elise has been the one orchestrating the hidden transfers this entire time. She used her logistics network to route the firm's capital into her own holding companies. She set up the Cayman accounts under my name without my permission to create a plausible fall guy. These emails explicitly show Elise authorizing the embezzlement and directing Carter on exactly how to bypass the internal auditing software. She is the mastermind. She is trying to destroy our parents and throw me in prison out of pure petty jealousy because she was never the favorite child. She turned dramatically, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly at me as I stood calmly on the grand stage. "Arrest her!" Brittany screamed to the security guards, playing the victim with absolute chilling conviction. "She is the one stealing from the firm. I am completely innocent. She manipulated all of us." The ballroom held its collective breath. Brittany's performance was desperate, but she was banking entirely on the fact that corporate executives were naturally suspicious of hostile takeovers. She was hoping that by muddying the waters with forged digital evidence, she could create enough reasonable doubt to delay the federal investigation and secure a window for her own escape. I looked down at my sister from the elevated platform. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not engage in a screaming match to defend my honor against a cornered, panicked liar. I simply uncoiled the microphone cable, my movements slow, deliberate, and entirely relaxed. I walked down the velvet-lined steps of the stage, the crowd automatically parting to give me a wide, unobstructed path. Dominic fell into step right beside me, his presence a towering silent warning to anyone who dared interfere. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from Brittany. I looked at the glowing screen of her phone, glancing briefly at the fabricated emails she had hastily drafted in a pathetic attempt to frame me. They were poorly constructed, full of basic routing errors and amateur formatting mistakes. It was the digital equivalent of a child writing a forged hall pass in crayon. I did not bother addressing the crowd. I spoke directly to Brittany, my voice a quiet, razor-sharp blade that sliced effortlessly through her hysterical performance. "My software tracks digital footprints, Brittany," I said, my tone carrying the absolute chilling finality of an executioner. "Those emails were sent from your secure IP address, and the feds have already seized your hard drives. They are waiting at your house right now." The morning sunlight cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive boardroom like a surgical scalpel. The brilliant, unforgiving light illuminated every speck of dust, dancing above the massive mahogany table. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. I sat perfectly still at the head of the table, my hands resting lightly on the polished wood. Dominic sat immediately to my right, a silent, immovable fortress radiating quiet authority. His presence alone commanded absolute respect in a room that had spent decades trying to make me feel entirely invisible. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. My family did not make a grand entrance. They did not stride into the room with their usual aristocratic arrogance or their carefully manufactured country club superiority. They shuffled across the threshold like condemned prisoners walking toward the gallows. The physical toll of the previous 24 hours was staggering. Richard entered first, and he looked as though he had aged 20 years overnight. His typically perfect posture was completely gone. His shoulders sagged under the invisible crushing weight of his monumental failures. He wore a rumpled suit that looked entirely too large for his shrinking frame. He did not look like the ruthless patriarch of a real estate empire. He looked like a broken, exhausted old man who had finally run out of lies to tell. Patricia followed closely behind him, stripped of her gala glamour and her condescending sneer. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and darting frantically around the room as if searching for an emergency exit that did not exist. She clutched a designer handbag against her chest, like a protective shield, completely unable to process the total evaporation of her social and financial standing. Brittany walked in next, and she was entirely unrecognizable. The golden child, the untouchable favorite, was trembling violently. Her emerald silk gown from the night before had been replaced by a hastily thrown-on tracksuit. Her face was entirely bare of makeup, exposing the deep dark circles of pure terror beneath her eyes. She knew exactly what was waiting for her. She knew that federal agents had spent the early hours of the morning tearing apart her luxury condominium, seizing her hard drives and freezing every single asset tied to her name. She was staring directly into the barrel of a federal indictment, and the reality of her impending prison sentence had completely shattered her fragile psyche. And finally there was Carter. He trailed behind them, keeping a wide physical distance from the family he had tried to betray. He looked completely hollowed out. Vanessa had kept her word. She had walked out of the Crystal Pavilion, boarded a flight, and completely abandoned him to the absolute ruin he had created. He had no money, no allies, and no escape route. He was a dead man walking, and his vacant, staring eyes proved he knew it. They gathered around the opposite end of the massive table. They did not sit down. I had deliberately ordered building management to remove all the chairs from their side of the boardroom. If they wanted to face me, they were going to do it standing. I did not offer them coffee. I did not offer them pleasantries. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized stack of legal documents. I dropped the heavy file onto the mahogany table. The sharp, solid thud echoed loudly in the cavernous room, making Brittany physically jump. "Let us finalize this business transaction," I stated, my voice echoing with cold, clinical precision. Richard placed his trembling hands on the edge of the table, leaning his weight against the wood just to remain upright. "Elise, please." He started, his voice a hoarse, ragged rasp. "We can restructure. I have institutional investors who are willing to hear a turnaround pitch. If you just give me 30 days to reorganize the collateral, I can make you whole." I looked at him, feeling absolutely zero sympathy for the man who had spent his entire life treating me like a disposable asset. "There are no institutional investors left, Richard," I corrected him smoothly. "Every single financial backer pulled out the moment they heard the audio recording of your son-in-law confessing to federal wire fraud. Your firm is completely toxic. Your credit rating is non-existent. You do not have 30 days. You do not even have 30 minutes. I reached forward and slid the first set of documents across the smooth surface of the table until they rested directly in front of my father. "I am officially calling in the $3 million debt," I announced, tapping my manicured fingernail against the top page. "When you secretly purchased Carter's failing startup to spite me, you guaranteed the debt using the operational assets of this firm. You thought you were invincible. You thought your clever accounting tricks would hide the massive deficit. But you made one catastrophic, fatal miscalculation." Richard stared down at the paperwork, his eyes scanning the bold, highlighted acceleration clauses. His breath hitched in his chest as the mathematical reality of his ruin finally registered in his brain. To cover the continuous hemorrhaging losses of Brittany's failed boutique and to secretly fund her offshore Cayman accounts, you needed liquid capital. I explained, dissecting his financial crimes with surgical accuracy. You could not drain the firm's operational accounts without triggering an internal audit. So you leveraged your personal assets. You took out a massive high-interest mezzanine loan, and you used the family mansion as the primary collateral. Patricia let out a sharp, strangled gasp. She turned to stare at her husband, her eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated horror. "Richard, tell me she is lying," Patricia demanded, her voice shrill and trembling. "Tell me you did not mortgage our home." Richard could not even look at his wife. He kept his eyes glued to the foreclosure documents, a single tear slipping down his weathered cheek and landing silently on the crisp white paper. He had bet their entire aristocratic lifestyle on his ability to outsmart the market, and he had lost everything. Because the Securities and Exchange Commission froze all of Brittany's offshore assets last night, the firm officially entered into default at midnight. I continued, my tone relentless and entirely devoid of emotion. "You triggered the acceleration clause on the debt I acquired. The entire $3 million balance is due immediately. Since you have absolutely zero liquidity, the collateral is automatically forfeited." I slid the second document across the table. It was a formal, legally binding transfer of deed. "I own this firm," I stated, looking directly into my father's broken, weeping eyes. "I own this building. I own the commercial real estate portfolio. And as of 8 o'clock this morning, I officially own the family mansion. You have absolutely nothing left." The absolute finality of my words struck the room with the force of a physical explosion. Richard broke completely. The great patriarch, the man who had demanded total obedience and projected an aura of infallible superiority, collapsed forward against the mahogany table. He buried his face in his arms, weeping openly and loudly. It was a pathetic, wretched sound. He was mourning his money, his status, and his pride. He was mourning the only things he had ever truly loved. Brittany took a frantic step backward, pressing her back against the glass wall of the boardroom. She wrapped her arms tightly around herself, hyperventilating as she stared at the foreclosure documents. The reality that she was no longer a wealthy heiress, that she was facing federal prison without a single dime to pay for a defense attorney, paralyzed her completely. She did not even attempt to argue. She was entirely broken. Carter remained silent, staring blankly at the floor. He knew his fate was already sealed in a federal evidence locker. But Patricia refused to surrender. She refused to accept that her reign of terror was officially over. The realization that she was losing her sprawling estate, her country club memberships, and her entire social identity snapped whatever remaining thread of sanity she possessed. She slammed her hands violently against the boardroom table. "You cannot do this!" Patricia shrieked, her voice tearing through the room, raw and hysterical. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face, her eyes wild with delusional fury. "You are our daughter. You cannot put us on the street. We gave you life. We raised you. You owe us your loyalty. You cannot just take everything we have and throw us out like garbage." She was crying real tears now. They streamed down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup. She was trying to use the ultimate emotional weapon. She was trying to weaponize the concept of family to manipulate me into saving her from her own disastrous choices. She expected me to fold. She expected the quiet, obedient scapegoat to finally cave under the pressure of a mother's tears. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small, inadequate, and entirely unloved. I looked at the woman who had actively cheered when my husband walked out on me. I looked at the woman who had called me a failure. I felt absolutely nothing. I slowly picked up my expensive fountain pen from the table. I placed the gold cap over the nib, pressing it down until it clicked with a sharp, satisfying sound. I folded my hands together, resting them on the pristine leather binder containing my new corporate portfolio. My face remained an absolute mask of cold, unyielding authority. "You gave me a roof and you charged me my dignity for rent," I said, my voice dropping to a low, powerful register that commanded total silence in the room. "I am not putting you on the street. I am simply finalizing a business transaction, just like you did when you chose Carter's startup over my future." Patricia stared at me, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The realization that her emotional manipulation had completely permanently failed finally registered in her panicked mind. She had no weapons left. She had no leverage. She was entirely powerless. I turned my gaze away from my mother, completely dismissing her existence. I looked toward the heavy double doors at the back of the boardroom. I slid the thick stack of foreclosure documents across the table toward my lead corporate attorney, who stepped out of the shadows to retrieve them. "Security will escort you out of my building now." The two towering security operatives stepped forward, their massive frames easily blocking any potential path of resistance. They flanked my parents with practiced, entirely unyielding precision. Richard did not fight. He moved like a hollowed-out shell, his feet dragging heavily across the expensive boardroom carpeting as he was physically guided toward the glass exit. Patricia, however, fought the reality of her eviction until the very last second. She twisted her shoulders, her voice muffled and frantic behind the thick, soundproof glass of the boardroom doors as they finally clicked shut, severing her connection to the empire forever. It was the absolute last time I ever allowed them in my presence. The ensuing 6 months moved with the swift, merciless efficiency of a corporate guillotine. The federal authorities descended on the Wilson family empire like a swarm of starving locusts, picking the bones of their fraudulent enterprises completely clean. Carter was the first to entirely break under the unrelenting pressure of the federal investigation, stripped of his ill-gotten seed capital and completely abandoned by Vanessa, who had vanished into the wind the very night of the gala, leaving no forwarding address. He found himself entirely devoid of resources. Without the Wilson family's stolen money to fund his defense, Carter was forced to rely on an overworked, utterly exhausted public defender. He had absolutely no leverage to fight a federal wire fraud indictment. Terrified of a maximum security prison sentence, he took a brutal, comprehensive plea deal. Today, the man who had arrogant, sociopathic delusions of becoming the city's next tech billionaire is working a grueling, grease-stained minimum wage job at a suburban fast food drive-thru. Every single cent of his meager bi-weekly paycheck is automatically garnished by the state to pay his mounting legal fees and the court-ordered restitution he will owe for the rest of his natural life. He spends his days wearing a polyester uniform, forced to hand paper bags of cheap food through a sliding window, constantly terrified that one of his former elite peers might pull up to the speaker box and recognize him. Brittany fared no better in the eyes of the law or the court of public opinion. The golden child who had spent her entire existence wrapped in a protective, heavily funded cocoon of parental favoritism and stolen luxury was unceremoniously thrown to the wolves. The federal prosecutors possessed mountains of irrefutable, crystal-clear digital evidence proving her direct involvement in the embezzlement and offshore money laundering scheme. Facing decades behind bars, Brittany's manufactured composure completely disintegrated. She sobbed, she begged, and she ultimately pleaded guilty to a massive laundry list of financial crimes. She managed to avoid federal prison only by eagerly turning state's evidence against her own father, earning herself a suffocating, highly restrictive 5-year probation sentence. But the legal system was the least of her punishments. Her true consequence was complete and total social execution. Elite society is incredibly unforgiving to those who lose their wealth, and they are downright vicious to those caught stealing it. Brittany was immediately and permanently blacklisted from the very circles that once worshipped her. The country clubs formally revoked her memberships. Her former socialite friends blocked her number, deleted her from their social media, and actively crossed the street to avoid being photographed near her. The glittering, champagne-soaked world she had valued above basic human decency permanently closed its doors, leaving her entirely isolated, irrelevant, and utterly forgotten in a reality she despised. As for Richard and Patricia, their spectacular, catastrophic downfall was the main event of the financial news cycle for weeks. The bank aggressively foreclosed on the family mansion, publicly auctioning off their antique furniture, their luxury vehicles, and the very artwork they had used to project their aristocratic superiority. Richard's real estate firm was completely liquidated by federal auditors to satisfy the massive, staggering debts he had accumulated. He was stripped of his broker's license, heavily fined by the SEC, and permanently banned from ever holding any executive corporate position again. Today, the former king and queen of the city's elite reside in a cramped, poorly ventilated 2-bedroom apartment on the far edge of the industrial district. The walls are paper-thin, the ancient plumbing rattles constantly through the night, and the view from their single barred living room window overlooks a decaying, abandoned strip mall. They have absolutely no wealth, no status, and no captive audience left to manipulate. Stripped of the superficial markers and stolen money they valued above their own daughter's well-being, they are forced to spend their remaining years locked in a tiny, suffocating box, stewing in their own bitter, toxic resentment. They have absolutely nothing left but each other, a fitting, perfectly poetic punishment for two people entirely incapable of genuine love. I did not revel in their misery. I did not follow their court dates or track their auctions. I simply stopped thinking about them entirely. The toxic heavy weight that had suffocated me for over 3 decades was finally lifted from my chest, leaving behind a profound, untouchable, and brilliant peace. The warm, golden afternoon sun washed over the sprawling back lawn of my private estate, casting long, lazy shadows across the perfectly manicured grass. The air was thick with the rich, smoky, mouth-watering aroma of a backyard barbecue, mingling perfectly with the sweet, delicate scent of blooming jasmine climbing the stone trellis. I stood near the edge of the large, expansive stone patio, a genuine relaxed smile playing across my face as I watched the scene unfolding before me. There were no toxic relatives calculating their next manipulation in the corners of my home. There were no hushed passive-aggressive insults being traded over hors d'oeuvres, and there were no suffocating, impossible expectations hanging in the air. The people occupying my estate today were my chosen family. My lead engineers and corporate directors were laughing loudly, their voices carrying over the gentle ambient music as they engaged in a highly competitive game of cornhole near the edge of the rose garden. My closest friends, the remarkable women who had stood by me when I was navigating the darkest, most treacherous moments of my life, were lounging comfortably on the plush patio furniture. They were sharing a bottle of vintage wine, trading effortless jokes, and entirely at ease. The energy radiating across the lawn was pure, authentic, and utterly devoid of the poisonous transactional drama I had permanently left behind. I watched Dominic step away from the massive stainless steel grill, his broad, athletic shoulders relaxed under a casual, unbuttoned linen shirt. He moved with that same quiet, unshakable confidence that had always drawn me to him, but the sharp, dangerous, calculating edge he reserved exclusively for the boardroom was entirely gone. His dark eyes were warm and unguarded. He navigated smoothly through the crowd of laughing friends, holding two condensation-covered glasses of sweet iced tea. Suddenly, a small, joyous, piercing shriek cut through the ambient chatter of the barbecue. Lily darted across the vibrant green grass, her tiny legs pumping as fast as they could possibly carry her. She was chasing a massive, brilliant yellow swallowtail butterfly that fluttered just out of her reach. Her bright sundress whipped around her knees as she spun in circles, her face tilted toward the bright blue sky, completely consumed by the pure, innocent magic of the chase. Her uninhibited laughter was a bright musical chime that echoed across the yard, making my chest tighten with an overwhelming, absolute surge of profound love. She did not have to earn her place in this yard. She did not have to perform for affection or navigate a minefield of narcissistic conditions. She was simply allowed to exist entirely safe, wildly happy, and unconditionally cherished. Dominic reached my side, pulling my attention away from the garden. He handed me one of the frosted glasses of iced tea, the ice cubes clinking softly against the crystal as our fingers brushed. He did not say a single word. He simply smiled, wrapping his free arm securely around my waist and pulling me flush against his side. I leaned my head against his chest, instantly comforted by his solid presence and the steady, familiar rhythm of his heartbeat. We stood together in comfortable, perfect silence, watching the sky slowly transition into a breathtaking, sweeping canvas of deep purples, soft pinks, and fiery oranges. The vibrant colors of the sunset reflected off the calm, glass-like surface of the estate's private lake, painting our entire world in warm, radiant light. I took a slow, refreshing sip of the sweet tea, letting the cool liquid wash down my throat as I looked at the incredible, entirely authentic life I had built from the ashes of my past. The thriving, ethical, and massive software company. The loyal, genuine friends who valued me for exactly who I was. The man who stood beside me not as a competitor to be feared, but as an equal, fiercely protective partner. And the beautiful, happy little girl running freely through the yard holding the promise of a future completely untainted by generational trauma. My parents had always firmly believed that power was exclusively measured by the balance of an offshore bank account, and that true success was defined entirely by the shallow envy of your social peers. They were entirely catastrophically wrong. My true wealth was not the millions of dollars safely secured in my diverse investment portfolios. It was not the massive global real estate and technology empire I now flawlessly controlled. My true wealth was the absolute, unshakable, and permanent freedom of never needing my toxic family's validation ever again. I had completely broken the cycle, and the beautiful, limitless future belonged entirely to me.